Hello, everyone. Welcome to anyone who just joined the summit. So our next session is on the do's and don'ts of nurturing career growth, hosted by Anna, our CEO and co-founder at Meander, and with two incredible speakers. So we have Rosemary Hitchcock, who's Director of Engineering at Bumble, and Brian Donohue, VP of Product at Intercom. So they will be discussing how to identify potential early on, how to support career transition, and think about the future state of your team and a whole more insights. So enjoy the session, and over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Manel. So just to remind everyone who is just joining us, we'll have a panel conversation for the next 25 minutes, but then we'll transition to your questions. So do not hesitate to share them under the LinkedIn live stream or in AirMeet whenever it's more comfortable, and we'll get to your questions at the end. And first of all, welcome, Rose. Welcome, Brian. Great to see you both. Maybe you could do a quick intro to your career highlights just to introduce yourself. Rose, let's start with you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Rose. As mentioned, I'm engineering director at Bumble. I've been at Bumble for around 3 years, looking after the Badoo app and all of the teams that work on that. And previous to that, I worked for 10 years at what is now Yoox Net-a-Porter. It was Net-a-Porter originally, in various roles in engineering. The last few years spent as a head of technology there. And also along the way, somehow managed to squeeze in having 3 children. So yeah,
oh,
life's
wow.
a bit difficult.
Incredible. Brian?
Hey, folks. I'm Brian. I'm an American living in Ireland the last 20 years, but I still cannot figure out how to do an Irish accent. So we'll see if I can figure that out over the next 20 minutes. I come from a UX background. I worked for a consultancy in Dublin and then made the leap over to product management and Intercom, where I've been the last 10 years and work across all the core product teams at Intercom. Not
Incredible.
quite. Still single digits. 9 years and something.
Awesome.
And I also have 3 kids.
Ooh. Really great. I mean, working parents are my heroes. Judy from the last session woke up at 6 a.m. to join us because she's taking care of her kids as well. So let's dive into this topic of nurturing career growth, because that's such an important area for any manager. And I think there are so many changes happening right now for many managers trying to find their place in supporting their employees. And I think one of the interesting things that changed is that people are starting to think about their careers as portfolio. So essentially not staying in one company for a long time, going from one company to another, and just trying to find what would best work for their strengths and interest development. So how do you think this changes the role of a manager supporting people on this path? Rose, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think as managers, we're always trying to find that balance between what's best for the company and what the company needs, and also what's best for the individuals, obviously in your team that we're motivated to grow and support. And I think there's a lot of overlap between those two things in many cases. But sometimes, somebody's skills and somebody's ambition, there isn't a fit for that at that time, or maybe even ever within your team. So if I don't have a fit within my team for what somebody wants, my first preference is always to try and find them somewhere else internally, if possible, because if it's somebody who's motivated and demonstrated that they're good at their job, and I believe that they're ready for a new challenge, as I'm thinking about what's best for the company, I think retaining their knowledge, their dedication to the company and their enthusiasm somewhere else is still better than losing them altogether. But sometimes that is also the right choice for them. And the choice is actually that I can support them to be ready to find that next step externally to the company. And I try to also look for the positives in that when somebody who's, really great in your team leaves, it also brings opportunity for new talent to come in. And I think actually it's really nice to always keep that balance of people who really know, the ways of working, the product, the people well, but also have a balance of new ideas and diversification of thought coming into the team. So if it's time for somebody to move on, I try to celebrate what they've achieved and not like feel like it's a personal, like a failure on my part because I haven't been able to find them the opportunity that they wanted. And I think that has changed over time. I think, when I started out in my career, like people tended to stick around a little bit longer, and it was like almost you were a good manager if nobody ever left your team. And I do see that that's changed now. And actually, I mean, working in tech, I actually feel like if it's like 3 years, someone's been in the company, I feel like that's a good achievement, and that's okay. Someone leaves within 6 months, maybe we need to look at what went wrong. But if it's 3 years, I'm like, this is amazing. 3 years, So yeah, I do see that's changed quite a lot. And I think, we just have to embrace that and look for the benefits that it can bring to the team.
Awesome. Brian?
Yeah, the phrase portfolio career is kind of a bit cringy, but I think the reality of it is for sure what Rose is talking about now. So, at 5 years, people are like, "Oh my God, I'm here so long." 5 years feels like a really, really long time to be in any place. And if you're 10 years, it's like you're a lifer at that point. So the time frames have definitely shortened, definitely in the tech world. And I think like the phrase portfolio career doesn't sit well in my head, because what I picture is like people are optimizing for what their CV looks like, and that's probably not really what they're doing. I don't know, who knows what the phrase is actually intended to be, but I think people are ideally optimizing for learning, and they're optimizing for promotions and money, some mix of those things, and you hope the learning is a big chunk of it. And as Rose was saying, like there's points at which it's just healthy to leave. We had you can have people who leave who are like, I really like the company, I really like the teams I'm working with, I'm just ready for a change. We had someone who's engineer who's 7 years with us, as his first job out of college. He's like, I just need to experience something different. And something that, so I think for sure, in that time, it's like to Rose's point, hey, that's great. We kept him for so long because he probably has been wanting to leave for a while. I bet it was 3 years. It felt like a long time. And I think one of the other things that's interesting is like when people leave, when it's like, hey, I need change, I need a different environment, I need to try to challenge myself more. Also, like the boomerang thing, do people come back? Because like, hey, I tried something else and then I came back, and that always feels great when that happens. But so yeah, I think and a huge plus one to what Rose said, you're trying to match what the person wants with what the company needs. And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can be creative and you can make it work, and sometimes you just can't. So, a lot of departures are healthy departures, and it's like, hey, this is the right decision for you. So, yeah, it's for sure just the reality here, and a lot of it is, I think the challenge is like keeping the how long can you keep the best people? Like that's like the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that's ultimately the manager's job. How do you handle the situations where someone is thinking that they know what's best for them, but you actually see from another side that it probably is not the right step at the time? So, for example, they think that they would like to get into people management, but you see that they don't have the right skills at the moment, and they would just fail in this promotion. Brian, let's start with you here.
Yeah, I've kind of like, I initially took how you phrased that question one way. So I'll start with the one way, and then I'll come back to like if they want to go into people management or not. Like when someone says they're handing in their notice, usually it's too late to have any good conversation. Hopefully they say it when they're considering a lot of, and you could argue for, as a manager, you should never be surprised. And ideally you've had chats along the way, so you kind of knew that was happening. That's the ideal. And then sometimes if a manager on my team's had someone come out like, hey, can I have a chat? How close are they? Is there, and it's almost a chance for me to try to help them think through, hey, are you sure this is, I want to be sure they're not making the decision for reasons I may have context of where actually something here. So, I just want to be sure they're making like a fully informed decision. And that's kind of part what you're saying. Try to see if I could, and then sometimes you have the chat, you're like, you're right. As I was saying earlier, makes sense. I hear you. That's good luck in the next step. Then if someone's looking for a promotion or change or moving to the people manager track, and if you don't think that, so your question is, if you don't think they're suited, how do you handle that one? Like,
Yeah.
generally my approach is you have the most candid conversation you can is the best way, and you just kind of, delicately but honestly kind of frame, hey, here's where I have concerns right now, so this is where I'd be less confident of it. Maybe we can see if there's opportunities for you to take small steps there or something like that. But I think one thing that's definitely one principle I'd hold to is candor goes a long way. It goes a long way in hiring. It goes a long way in relationships, and it's like a two-way candor. It's like, hey, just tell me what you're thinking. It's healthy for you to tell me you're unhappy and thinking of leaving. It's healthy for you to tell me now you're starting to interview. We can just have a frank conversation about that. And so I think candor is usually, like, if you have that healthy, people can actually say, you need to phrase things, put some effort into how you phrase things, but generally just being candid goes a long way, builds trust, and it kind of opens that up. So in that situation, I'd kind of err on try to delicately frame why that step doesn't feel like the right next one, and then you can give them a chance to try to see if they can basically bolster that part of their skill set or something. I don't know. What do you think, Rose?
Awesome.
I mean, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think if you're not honest or candid, then there can be a mismatch between their expectations and actually what happens. And I think that disappointment really amplifies any frustration that they might be feeling about not getting it, because if they thought they might get a promotion to people manager and it hadn't been clear to them, they might feel like 3-4 times worse about it than if you just said to them, look, this is not happening at this time. I think one of the things that I always try to do is, where possible, try to make it as objective as you can. So sometimes you would have a role description or a career framework for the role that they're looking for, which is like ideal. But if you don't, you can at least try to objectively work through what are the requirements of that role and where are you in terms of how close you are to them. What I've seen in the past is that sometimes people think that if they've got one example of where they've demonstrated a skill or a competency, they think, okay, I've ticked that box, and then they're ready, rather than actually it being like a consistent pattern of behavior. So, like, for example, if you have someone who comes to you who wants to be a manager and they say, oh, I mentored this other person and they're now a manager, so therefore I've shown that I can grow managers. I'm ready. But I think what we need to say is, okay, that's one great example, but actually in all of these other cases, you were still operating, at the level below. And what we need to see is like multiple examples of how you've helped to grow people. So like, how have you built repeatable processes? How have like what you've demonstrated gone wider than just that one person you were talking to? Like, how can you scale this and it not just be like a lucky attempt because the person that you were helping got there with their own skill. So I think like trying to change something from a one-off tick box to actually repeatable patterns of behavior that they can demonstrate over, whatever period of time. I think for more junior promotions, like maybe 6 months perhaps is long enough. Okay, we've demonstrated the next level for 6 months. If it's a more senior promotion, you might want even more. You might want to say, I need to see like you achieving certain things for a year even, because it's a bit more risky to give some of those more senior roles. But yeah, generally, I think there's a lot of skills that that you can look at, and people might be really strong in one or two, like, for example, the hard skill in their area. But like on the people management skills, they might only think of like, oh, I can do a one-to-one and I can give feedback. But actually, there's a lot of other things that you have to do in a manager role, which is like represent your whole team, be really good at stakeholder communication, be really good at strategic thinking about the long-term future rather than just like the operational day-to-day. And they might not have even been aware of, some of the skills. They might just think about the part of their manager that they see, which might be, having a one-to-one every week. So I think, you can be really honest about where they have the skills and where they're strong, and also like where their gaps are. And hopefully they either agree with you and, put in the work to get there, or maybe they don't like the sound of those other skills and, change their mind if it's really not a good fit for them.
Awesome. How do you perceive the role of a manager in those types of career transitions? So we mentioned having those conversations and bringing the examples of the right behaviors to life. What else a manager could do to support people through those transitions, be it going from an IC to a people manager, going from one career to another, maybe even transitioning out of the team or the company? Rose?
Yeah, I think Like if it's a more junior person that's transitioning, then I would expect a manager to do a lot more hand holding. So if you, for example, somebody's moving from one type of role to another type of role, what I've always done is work with them to create a transition plan, kind of hand hold them through it to say, you know, these are going to be the steps. This is the timeline. This is where I expect you to be at that timeline. And also like perhaps a rollback plan, like what happens if it doesn't go well and you're not able to achieve. As people get more senior and they start to transition to other roles, I actually expect to see them driving that a lot more themselves. So they will actually say, this is what I plan to do over the next 3 to 6 months in order to like move into that role. And they'll kind of talk that through with you to say, do you agree this is a good plan? And like get feedback on how it's going. So I think it can depend, you know, if it's the first time they've transitioned, if they've moved roles a lot, you know, and also like how risky it is, you know, whether you're quite confident that they're going to be able to do it or not. I think the other thing that I like to consider is that these transitions don't always have to be a one-way street. So like, for example, if someone says, I want to be a manager, it doesn't mean that that's it now. They're off the IC track. They have to be a manager forever. And actually, if they become a manager for 2 years and then actually decide to move back into an IC track, the things that they've learned and those reusable skills around, you know, people, communication, strategy, delivery will be usable in their IC track. So it's not like, oh, now you've just kind of go back, you know, to where you were. You can still be more senior on an IC track using the skills that you built as a manager. So I think like, I wouldn't say like you kind of have this one path or this path. It's like you can have a little wiggly line between different paths, because so many skills that we look for in many roles, especially as you get more senior, you know, they are transferable. And it's only really the specific hard skills of that role that you probably need to specialize in. Many other skills at leadership levels, you know, are pretty much the same skills. So yeah, I think it is quite varied, just depending on the role and the level. But
makes sense. Brian, anything to add?
I'd pick up on the last point there of moving between IC and a manager role. We've got, particularly engineers. We've had a bunch of engineers who've done that, and I can think of one designer at least who did that. We actually haven't had any PMs who have done that yet, but there's probably like smaller numbers overall, or maybe PMs are just a weird type of people, you know. But yeah, I think that's an interesting one, and like that's like the healthiest one where you hope you have the scale and size where you can afford people the chance to try things, and then if it doesn't work out for them, you know, it can be a mutual way of like, hey, we think this isn't working out. Maybe you should go back, or vice versa. They're like, I just don't like this. And frequently it's, you know, people are really pulled back to IC. I just like doing the work. And that's where you have to be sure you have the IC track that has that growth potential, so they don't feel like there's a ceiling above them that's only available from the manager role. So yeah, it's meaningful shifts. Those aren't casual doors you can jump in between there. So, but I think it's a important principle and like a healthy thing in the org when people are kind of just trying things and experimenting and moving back. I think another job of the manager is also to think creatively about how can it's exactly what Rose said. It's like, what does the company need and what does the employee want? How much can we get that Venn diagram overlapping? And that's part of the manager's job of like, some of that is creativity. Some of that is, hey, there's a fair amount we can shape within your role and your focus. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 30%. And maybe that's enough. So maybe someone wants to get more commercially focused. And that could be engineering, design, or PM, right? There's like an opportunity to lean into that more. Or maybe someone who's considering changing between that. And it's like, hey, before you make a jump and then that's harder to move on, we can give you more parts of a project. So there's some relatively easy ways that you can just adapt to give people an opportunity to try different things, to explore if they like that sort of a role. And I think the other thing manager is kind of the responsibility of is like, what network do you have in the company? What chats can you set up? Just having those informal chats is really valuable, that other people may not know who to talk to or may not know this other project that's going on. So just, it's like pretty obvious stuff that I'm sure everyone does. But so I think it's incumbent on the manager to think creatively about how can we get that Venn diagram a bigger intersection of it without you either having to leave the company or having you to actually make a dramatic shift in role. And also just being comfortable of like, no, you can't do it here. You got to do it somewhere else, or you got to just jump to this other org and make the leap and see what happens. Just being open to all of those, but thinking creatively to try not to have it require a dramatic shift.
Yeah, makes sense. And I really like that you mentioned creativity, because a lot of people think about the roles as a closed box of very specific skills and kind of not looking out for opportunities that a company could provide them to explore some other areas and skills they could develop. To that point, I think many companies invest in career ladders, kind of trying to define how success at different levels look like. But also we see that many job requirements have been changing quite drastically. Like, for example, hiring a designer at Intercom and hiring a designer at Meta might be two very different things in terms of the skill set, in terms of requirements, in terms of what kind of people we might need. And it might differ even at the team level, not just at the company level. So how do you think about career ladders in this kind of evolving landscape where the definitions and requirements in terms of skills especially are changing quite frequently and quickly? Brian, let's start with you.
Well, one, I'd echo what Rose said earlier of like, I'd even say it's stronger of, you need job ladders to have a consistent structure to performance conversations. And I remember when we didn't have them, and you look back, you're like, God, we're so immature in how we were doing these things. So I think they're required. You just get to, it's not a big scale you need to get to where you need them, and they help, and everyone's shared all the ones. So you don't even have to do all the sweat to figure it out yourself the first time, which is a huge pain in the ass, but you just steal what's out there. Right. And it's probably pretty good. And then you can adapt it. And that just it is critical to have those consistent, fair conversations across. But I don't think they change that much. Like, I look back on our one, and it's 2.5 years, and like, you can always make it better, and it's really hard to articulate the difference between levels, but the core skill areas, or whatever we call the things, those are pretty stable. Like, those are, or I would say, very stable. You could argue things like AI is where you bring in a new angle, but that's probably like a subset within those, subset of within execution, or subset of within strategy. Are you able to adapt to that? So I think even there, they're pretty pliable. So I think the ladders are durable, and the bigger challenge is like carving out the different roles. Or, hey, if you bring in a staff one, can you articulate the difference between a staff and a senior? And then, or print, like, that's actually really hard to do. And the wordsmithing is kind of like, oh God, it gets really painful. So that part of it is hard, but the basic building blocks of the ladder are way more durable. So so that's where my head's at.
Yeah, I think, like, for me, even a slightly out of date career path is definitely still useful. And I think if you can write them in a way that's fairly generic, so if you're talking about a hard skill like system design, the actual patterns and tools that you use will change over time. But if the framework says, like, okay, at this level, you can create a design with support from a senior, at this level, you're designing independently, at this level, you're helping other more junior people to design, that remains the same. Whatever tool or framework you're using, can evolve, but try not to put that too much into the framework. And then, like, the soft skills, the things that go across all the roles around communication, collaboration, influencing, I think, they're always going to be important. But I guess because roles are changing so much, like, the thing that I try to do actually for myself and would recommend for other people to do is, like, instead of focusing too much on a specific job that you might be needing to work towards, or just the next job, I think just generally really thinking about, like, what are you good at? Like, where are your strengths? And making sure that you really build on your strengths and look for opportunities to grow them even stronger. The things that you love, the things that you enjoy, that come naturally to you, that's always going to be your foundation. So, like, make sure you know what those things are, and you're really, like, making those your strongest superpowers. But then conversely, you need to know what your weaknesses are, because if you have, like, one or two weaknesses, doesn't matter how good your strengths are, those weaknesses will hold you back. So you think, what are those things that are always at the bottom of your to-do list that you always, like, put off, or that make you really uncomfortable? And actually, you need to force yourself to get those skills up to a certain level so that they're not holding you back. So like, regardless of what the career matrix is saying, or the, the framework, I think you can always be aware of like your own strengths and weaknesses and how you're going to make them work for you, and find opportunities that play to your strengths, and make sure that your weaknesses or your slightly less strong areas aren't going to hold you back and prevent you from those things. And I think that's quite generic advice, but I think it kind of works with whatever framework that you have.
I think it's a really great point, and I really loved what you said about the fundamentals for the career ladder. So essentially focusing on kind of the general skills rather than specific tools. So essentially what people should be able to achieve rather than how they should be able to do that. And I think that's a really important difference in making your career ladder a success, because otherwise it will quickly go out of date.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just ask one last question and then we'll transition into a Q&A. So I think there is a view that managers should be managing not their current team, but their team in a year. So essentially trying to understand what the state they need to achieve in some time. So how you as managers identify potential and help people grow into it? Rose, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think like looking at potential, there's probably like two key aspects that I would look at. So firstly, I think it's really important to look at like, what is that person's appetite for personal growth? So like, are they actively working on improvement? Do they put their hand up for extra opportunities? Do they actually go and make their own opportunities to grow? I think like without that like appetite from them, it can be really difficult, and you can feel like you're trying to pull them rather than them pushing. And I think the second thing that I look at is like their historical performance. So how have they done when you've given them previous opportunities? How did they cope with challenges or unfamiliar situations? Like when I look at that, I don't expect them to have got everything right or for everything to have been perfect, but look at like, how did they cope? How did they approach coming up with a solution to a difficult problem? Or if something went wrong, like how did they handle that? And I think this is a really good indicator of future performance for me. So if I see like positive signs in both of those things, then what I try to do is look for opportunities to help grow those people further. So I'll give someone an opportunity to do something slightly bigger than they're doing now. And if that goes well, okay, then what's next? Don't just give them another thing the same size, but give them something different or something bigger to make sure that they're getting the benefit of building skills in various ways, and like gradually increasing their level of responsibility. And if it looks like it's too much, they're not enjoying it, they're not coping, or they say, okay, that's enough for me now, you can kind of slow down a bit, have a look if someone else wants that opportunity. So I think like just gradually building up and just seeing how people cope with that is probably the way that I do it, rather than anything too drastic.
Awesome.
There's a couple points jumping out at me for this one. So one is just to echo Rose's point of what's their growth mindset, the cliche, but it's massively true. But it's so huge barometers. How do people deal with feedback? And you'll go into and you'll say, I don't think this is going to land well, but you always have to be open-minded and give some. I've been proven wildly wrong, where I've just gotten completely wrong where I expected things would go, in a great way of someone totally took it on board and was all over it. But someone can do their best and fully be open-minded to the feedback and also not do well enough on it. And so this is the hardest part of the manager job, is like finding the bar, assessing the bar, and not accepting pretty good and nice person and really good effort. That's like the hardest thing, where that's not good enough. And are you willing to hold the bar where you got to be excellent? And then, so what that requires is spotting potential. And this is hugely subjective. And like, so in so much of what a good manager is, well, first of all, hiring is massive. And hiring is about potential, right? Like, you're not hiring because this person has done everything we need and therefore they can just keep doing that again. They're not going to want to come, right? You're spotting potential. Then you got to validate if the potential was there, and then you've got to like curate it and let it blossom and spark. So I think, and that's very subjective. So I think one other thought, that this was like a recent conversation we had on our PM leadership team, is trajectory. And this kind of goes to like the starting point of your conversation. And it was something we hadn't explicitly thought in our heads of what is our expectation for a trajectory? What if someone meets expectations several times in a row? Is that okay? Is that a bad thing? Or because it kind of doesn't feel right, but wait, we can't like arbitrarily make this up. And so the simple approach, I'm trying to avoid the word framework here. The simple approach that we used was like, well, if you're at the PM level, we don't have associate PMs. So if you're at the PM level, though, your trajectory should be reasonably fast towards senior PM. We need basically senior PM capabilities in our teams. So I can't remember the time frame we put to that, but so there's an expectation of a reasonably fast upward trajectory, say like 18 to 24 months or something. But then when you get to senior PM, hey, you're pretty independent. This is a good place for Intercom for you to be in. If you're a high performing senior PM, you're of high value to the team. But there's still some element of being stuck there too long, so it's like the time frame is longer to get from senior to staff. And then staff is like, shit, I don't know, maybe it could be 10 years at staff level. And that's a healthy thing. So that was kind of the way we were framing it. And you just, again, giving baseline guidance so everyone can think about this the same way. And so you can have conversations with people of like, hey, this is basically like, you're not getting stronger performance needed or however you do it, but we're not happy about where your trajectory is. And so you just need some like grounding of here's how we broadly think about it. And here's how we kind of think you're behind the trajectory we expect. So even though you're doing okay isn't good enough enough times in a row. So it's hard. Like this stuff is hard. And this is where you do need some structure. You can't wing this stuff. And you need just enough structure so that you're consistent across your team and your managers of how you're thinking about it, and enough structure so you're being fair to people. So you're not pulling this out of nowhere. Hey, we just came up with this new thing, trajectory, and we're going to kind of evaluate it as of today. So some element of structure on doing it. But I think it's an important one to think about is that trajectory and being deliberate about it, because it's not obvious, right? Sometimes, hey, they're high performing and they just stay that way, and that's great. As long as we can keep them there is good. So yeah, so it's tough ones to figure out.
No, I think that's super important to look at people's careers dynamically, not just statically where they're at this current point, but where they're going to be in some time. And I think that component is really missing from many career ladders that I saw and career frameworks that I saw as well. So that's such a great point about trajectories. Let's now transition to Q&A. And the first question is from Alexander. Many folks eventually come to a question on what's next. And I see staff principal or M1, I assume the management one. How do you as managers help people to make this decision? Rose, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, I think I would like revisit like what I said a little earlier about like what are your key strengths and superpowers, and what are the things that that you don't enjoy. There's different ways you can look at it, but it's really like making sure that you're spending like the majority of your day doing the things that you're best at. Obviously, we all have to do some things that, you know, we don't enjoy or we're not best at, but like what is the reason that you've got to the level that you're at now, and what are the key strengths that you've exhibited to get there, and what part of the job do you enjoy the most? I think that would be where I would start, because I do think like as we spend most of our time working, like it's actually like let's not spend most of our day doing things that we don't actually enjoy. I think sometimes people can be just driven because they think one path or the other has more financial benefit. And actually it's something that we've worked on a lot internally to try to like have really good career paths for both IC and manager. So if people want to switch to manager, it's because they enjoy the leadership and the people development part of the role, and not just because they think, well, I kind of maxed out my salary on IC, I need to move. And I think it is, you know, really important not to just do it for the money, because you will probably just get stuck at like your first or second level of manager and not you know, be excelling at it, but also not be enjoying it, and potentially move back to IC. But yeah, I think the other thing that we talked about was that, you know, it's okay to try it for a few years, like give it some time. I would say at least like 2 years. Don't just do like 6 months and switch. But if you've never been a manager before, it's quite hard to know whether you're going to love it. You might like mentoring people, you might like talking to different teams. So you think, oh, I'll love management. And actually, you might find that you don't. So I do think, like, especially like when you're earlier in your career, it's okay to like try this out and get some good skills from that, even if you then decide to go back. But yeah, I think, self-reflecting on your strengths, deciding whether or not you want to go for something and give it a shot, and just really thinking about what energizes you and like where you're going to add the most value with your skill set.
Great. Brian, anything to add?
Though I'd add what's probably obvious, but is talk to folks, particularly folks who have recently made the change, but regardless of the discipline, because you'll just, some things will resonate more or less when they kind of reflect on, hey, what do they like about the move and what do they dislike? But it is to Rose's point of, there's some element of you just got to try it to see, and it's unpredictable. And some people love it right away. Some people are excellent at people management, and we've had people who are excellent at it and they do not like it at all. They got out of it. They're just like, but you're so good, don't leave. But so it's unpredictable. So there's a certain element where you just got to try it and see. But I think just having the chats with folks who will, and everyone's always happy to share their candid, here's what's hard, here's what sucks about it, here's what I love about it, and here is the balance right. So I think that is probably the easiest way, where when you hear someone riffing on it, you can kind of yeah, I think that's the boat I'm going to be in. Because that's where the place you can kind of reflect of, do you actually have an organic draw here, or are you trying to, just as Rose saying, what's your real motivation? Are you interested in doing these things, or are you just trying to move up the ladder? Just trying to be honest with yourself, because probably it's okay for part of it to be moving up the ladder. You just don't want that to be the main driver, right? Then it's
not the wrong ladder.
Yeah,
exactly. Awesome. We have a great question from the live stream. Can you share any strategies that worked for you when someone handed in their notice, but you managed to retain them? Brian, Rose, any examples from any of you?
I don't think.
Yeah, I'm not a big.
It's usually too late. That's where it's like because someone's gone through all of the emotional, will I, won't I, will it, and they're just like, I can't wait to tell you and be over this. I don't want to go through I'm worried of this meeting, of telling you. I just want to get through with it. And so we rarely engage in any sort of counter offers. We've tried them sometimes, usually they're not successful, and it's almost disappointing if it came down just to that. In a way, you almost don't want it to win. Like, is someone really just leaving for money? Then just, and sometimes that's fair, and I don't want to like downplay or dismiss it. It's like, hey, it's usually too late. And I'm trying to think if there are any good examples. And so I think the real answer is, well, you might just have to wait a year or two, and that will be the real test, or 3 or 4. But yeah, I don't think I don't think I have any note. It's the only, if they haven't handed in the notice, but they have an offer, then it's a little closer, because then they're like, they haven't made their mind up yet. But there's almost a element of psychology you're playing. If someone has actually accepted the offer, usually in that case, I'm just like, hey, can I just understand content? I just want to hear it firsthand, what you're thinking, what's going on, just so we can learn from it. But yeah, at that point, it's usually wasted effort. So any bit earlier, any bit of the door actually open, but once their door is closed in their head, you can't really open that up. I don't know, Rose, have you had any?
Yeah, no, I really echo that. I think the only time where I might have seen it is if somebody actually just went and got another offer just because they wanted to get a pay rise. But I think that's actually a reflection of slightly immature pay practices that you have internally, because you shouldn't get to the stage where you could actually pay someone more and you just haven't until they come with a counter offer. Now, obviously, sometimes that happens because, companies move fast, the market moves fast. This is sometimes what happens. But I think ideally, you're able to pay everyone in your team like a fair salary, and this is not the reason that they're leaving. And as you say, psychologically, they're already mentally out of the door when they're handed in their notice. So, if it's got to that stage and you haven't been able to turn it around, and then they've already handed their notice in, I think it's unlikely that you really will. When I have seen people be counter offered in the past, it doesn't normally last long. And it does make me quite wary to do any kind of counter offer. If it's like because they want a promotion or something, often it's because you can't offer it to them internally. So yeah, I don't know that there's any strategies after that point. I would say like, I think Brian mentioned it earlier, but like these kind of things shouldn't be a surprise. Like ideally you're aware that they're looking for something else and you can try to address it earlier by finding them an internal opportunity. If they're really upset about pay, like trying to support them like internally with whatever requests they've got, or trying to find an opportunity that will motivate them, even if it's not a promotion at that time. So I think earlier in the process, there's many ways to engage with like the reasons they're thinking about leaving. But yeah, once they've handed their notice in, try to just make it like a nice handover, wish them well, leave the door open for them to come back, you know, and make sure that everyone leaves happy and that ideally they work their notice, they hand over to whoever's taking over their work, and, you know, we part as friends in the hope that one day our paths will cross again.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you saying is that you need to invest in relationships with them so that they could tell you before they actually made a decision and you could have an opportunity to correct the situation for them.
Yes.
Yeah. And I would just add, even not just having relationships, but you have to probe as manager. You know, that's where like the headspace chat, you need to probe and open that up and invite that conversation rather than expecting them to actually say it. So I think that's where the manager skills of hearing something small and saying, oh, this is actually seems like something, this is a thread we should pull on. That's like a huge part of the manager, is getting the signals, hearing the things, but also giving the space for that conversation to happen is actually, so it's not just, you can have a healthy relationship, but they don't want to tell you because it's awkward, right? So it's there. That's like, I think where those little subtle skills can go a long way of where, wait, that seems off what you're saying there. Tell me more, what's going on? And then, so it's basically, you got to listen to all the signals so you can know when to have that conversation early.
That's a really interesting point. I heard some managers asking this really radical question, like, if you decided to leave in a year, why? And essentially just framing this conversation about the reasons why people would decide to leave. Are you asking the same type of questions, or is it a different type of conversation?
No, like the one that I find useful is we just call it the headspace check. And you just say, where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? You know, 1 is you want to pull up the duvet, and 10 is you're skipping into work. And it's really interesting because everyone's got their own internal scale. You know, some people's ceiling is an 8, and some people's floor is a 6, and some, you know, everyone's got their own internal scale, but that's what gives you a chance. So you can have a 1-to-1. And then you ask that headspace question, you're like, oh, wait, you're at a 4. Oh, shit. Okay, no, we need to, like, what's going on here? Whereas, or the counter version, someone could be like, oh, well, this and that. But then, like, where are you? Well, I'm like at a 7, 7.5. It's great. People really want specificity of the number. 9 is not enough option. So that's how we do it. That's like the thing to lean in on that gives you that chance to make sure you didn't miss it. Of like, oh, this seemed like they're doing pretty good. And that's where the number thing can just say, oh, I missed the signal, but the number was like, oh, there's something to dig in here. Let's be sure what's going on. Or then if you do it consistently, we kind of map it out and you see you're kind of at 4 or 5 for a while now. This is therefore a high risk. Like there's no way this isn't high risk. So we need to have frantic conversation. So that's our route in. Well, our route. A bunch of people use that route.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for sharing your advice and your insights on this topic. I think this was really insightful for our listeners. And now over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, Rosemary. So for those joining us via live stream on LinkedIn, we'll be back online at 5 p.m. For those joining us via our Meet, you can join our speed networking session. So you will be paired with another attendee for 7 minutes, and we'll do that twice. We suggest one icebreaker if you want to use it. So what's a simple but important lesson you've learned about being a leader, and how does it help you in your daily work? All right. Enjoy the session.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.